Chris Camillo is a social arbitrage trader and investor. Join us here on Leading Indicator for a conversation all about robotics and humanoid robots. Chris, this stuff is awesome. Thank you for being here.
Happy to be here, man.
All right, so there's a lot of hype over companies like Aptronic, just closed another $400 million in Series A. You got the Jeff Bezos-backed company Figure AI, which right now values itself at about $39 billion. Chris, how do you define the appetite that we're seeing for this space right now?
Well, I feel like we went from overly skeptical a year ago to maybe just a little bit overhyped, specifically on people's timelines of what they're now expecting out of the humanoid space. I still think it's potentially the largest sector of our lifetime. I don't think we're going to see millions of humanoids in the next few years working commercially like some people are expecting now. I think I've gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves, but we're somewhere in the middle.
What was the timeline people were thinking, and what do you think is the more realistic timeline?
You know, I think there are a lot of people that are just getting a little too excited. They're seeing videos of humanoids doing flips and dancing and being really articulate, right? But you have to understand that in order to be commercially viable, to have these humanoids in commercial production environments, in warehouses, logistics facilities, manufacturing facilities, we just have a little bit more work to do. I think realistically, we'll find the winning form factor within 3 to 7 years that will be highly scalable. I think by the early 2030s, we will see millions of humanoids being deployed in commercial facilities around the world. And listen, that's not that far away. That's like 5+ years away. I just don't think it's happening in the next 1 to 3 years, as some others suspect. And that's just based on me being heavily involved with the sector for the past few years, deeply engaged with some of the C-level execs in the sector and roboticists, and being more pragmatic about the last few humps that we need to get over to be able to really be manufacturing these in scale. But what's more important than the manufacturing is our ability to deploy them at scale, right? To actually onboard them in production environments and have them working 20, 22 hours a day at 80 to 100% of human speed. We're very close, but getting to that last mile is tricky.
What is the bull case as to why the sector of humanoid robots could prove to be a $1 trillion market?
Well, physical human labor is close to 50% of global GDP. And as you've heard Elon say, it could radically change how we think about economies. And what he means by that is when you actually are capable of deploying an infinite labor machine, because that's essentially what we're discussing here. We're discussing the concept of having an infinite labor machine, meaning a machine that could do any piece of physical labor globally in infinite quantities. And when you have something like that, we could birth new industries. We can grow existing industries to levels of scale that were never imaginable. So the embodied AI sector, which is what we think of when we think of humanoids, actually has potential to be larger than global GDP is today, right? So yes, it's half of global GDP is physical labor. We're not going to displace all physical labor with humanoids anytime soon. But what we can do is massively grow industries and actually birth new industries when we have access to an infinite labor machine. So this is by far the concept of the embodiment of artificial intelligence into physical machines that could actually do physical work here on Earth and beyond is the biggest thing we've ever seen in our lifetime. But give it some time. Give it 3, 5, 7, 8 years to really unfold. I think the next 12 to 24 months is about proving their ability to handle that last mile, to actually work at human speed in a production facility durably, right? To see that these bots can actually retain that level of work 20 hours a day for months on end, right? Are we going to find joints overheating, wires fraying, connectors breaking? Those are a lot of unknowns that just have been untested. So we have a lot of work to do the next 12 to 24 months in this sector to prove that these machines are ready for prime time. We believe they are. They're close, but we have a little bit of work left to do.
Or God forbid, some type of disastrous iRobot type of scenario playing itself out. I mean, all jokes aside, obviously, I think when people look at this technology, Chris, that's kind of what they're going to think of. They're going to think, oh, the machine's overtaken and it's attacking Will Smith and we're all doomed. How do you put that kind of fictionalized context into the context of the actual story for people who might only know what they see in the movies?
I think it's reasonable to have concerns about AI and also embodied AI. But when you think about the concerns that revolve around embodied AI, which, by the way, is partially, FSD, like a car moving 100 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour down a road where we have children playing, right? That could be a concern, and that's why it's taking us so long to deploy full FSD in a way that's safe for the general public. What concerns me more, if you were going to go into how bots could be dangerous, are nanobots and microbots, right? The things that we see in stories like Black Mirror. When you think about the embodiment of AI inside of a 140-pound robot that's working in a factory with a battery that maybe lasts 3 or 4 hours, we don't need to be concerned about that for a very long time. There's all other forms of bots, whether they're micro or whether they're drones, that could be manufactured in the millions and be very difficult to actually even see coming, that I think would be more concerning for embodied AI. So humanoids are not a sector where I think there's a lot of concern. At first, they'll be working behind closed doors in safe environments, basically just helping humans be more productive in a commercial setting. And by the way, a lot of the conversations that have been had with CEOs around the world, some of these companies that are the largest employers of physical labor, I can tell you transparently that those conversations are not around displacing human labor. Nearly every one of those conversations around expanding physical labor, right? Working with their human labor to be able to do more. Because a lot of these demographic shifts that are happening around the world are making it really difficult for us to find younger labor to replace the jobs that we're losing in these industries.
So I'm glad you brought that up. Let's jump ahead to that part of our conversation. There are, of course, big, sweeping, structural complexities to overall robot transformation, the loss of wages, the loss of real spending power for Americans in the day-to-day economy, especially everyone who works in the manufacturing sector. Talk to us a bit more about how those considerations, both the positive and maybe the not so positive realities of all of this, how are those being deliberately considered by the biggest players in the space?
Okay, well, think about it. If you have an infinite labor machine, that, by the way, won't be infinite for a very long time. There's a lot that goes into the last mile of onboarding a robot into hundreds of human jobs across factory settings. This could be a multi-decade long initiative. But when you think about that, think about all the work that is going to create for humans, right? If you're talking about expanding industry, you can't expand industry without additional resources being required that are probably higher quality jobs than the jobs that these individuals are in today, right? So first of all, I don't think this is going to happen quickly. I think it will happen slowly. And when it does happen, I feel that it will create meaningfully more jobs and better jobs than those jobs that it will eventually be displacing. Look at every single job displacing technology throughout all of mankind. There hasn't been one situation where that hasn't resulted in more and better jobs being created for humans. I don't think this is any different. Does it mean we could have some industry sectors that have some level of displacement over the next 10 or 20 years where we have to have some transitionary period of time? Yes, absolutely. But overall, I'm confident this is going to be a benefit for humanity and actually a benefit for workers as opposed to being a negative.
When are you hoping to own one, if at all?
Well, part of the reason why I'm investing in a lot of the early stage humanoid companies, because I want to get one of them as soon as humanly possible, right?
I figured.
Like, I have kids, I have animals, like just do the simplest of things around my home would make a really big difference. But it's a great question. I think most of the humanoids being deployed are for structured work. You do hear some CEOs talking about testing humanoids in the home over the course of the next year. That will be really limited scale. I imagine that will only be be in the homes of employees of that company that are trained to work with these humanoids. They're not at a level yet where I believe they're safe to be in the home in that capacity. Unstructured work is going to require something closer to generalized autonomy, right? So this is generalized autonomy, which is essentially the AGI for robotics, where you can have a robot that can be trained to essentially do any human task in close to real time. That is still years away. I don't think we see humanoids in the home in any sort of scale for probably a decade or longer. That's just my personal opinion. I don't think it. Will you see it in small scale? Absolutely. Large scale, where guys like me and you are going to seriously consider having a humanoid in the home to help, do the dishes and do the laundry. It's coming. That's a guarantee. I don't know if it's coming for at least a decade at any sort of scale.
I don't know if I think it's absolutely awesome or absolutely terrifying, but I promise you it's one of those two, and it's nothing in between. Let me ask you more specifically about Tesla, Elon Musk, the Optimus component about all this. Obviously, that's one of the names that's going to understandably make more headlines maybe than the rest. How are you viewing the potential rollout for Optimus relative to competitors in the space, Chris?
A lot of times when Elon says big things, we don't know whether to believe him or not. I was one of those guys that did not believe him when he was promoting FSD 10 or 12 years ago. And I said, hey, this is going to be way further off than Elon is saying. I also feel the same way when he speaks about humanoids. I think his timelines are off. But what he is saying is absolutely correct. The end game for humanoids at Tesla is meaningfully larger than anything else the company has ever done. I put out a tweet thread in January of 24 at Chris Camillo, 15-part tweet about how just the Optimus division of Tesla could theoretically be valued at 10 trillion by the end of 2030. And that's only with 1 million commercial and industrial humanoids being deployed globally. And that's because these humanoids are being deployed at something relatively close to their human equivalent output value. So there's a tremendous amount of value for a commercial and industrial humanoid. I do feel that Tesla is going to be a top 3 or 4 company. Maybe they're number 1. It really doesn't matter. I think this is a $10 trillion plus opportunity over the next 5 to 8 years for Optimus and Tesla. By the way, as well as the other 2 or 3 leading humanoid companies, whoever they end up being, whether it's companies like Aptronic, companies like Figure, or maybe Boston Dynamics that has shown some recent, really interesting hardware tech coming out of Hyundai.
What are some of the other use cases for robotics outside of the world of manufacturing that most excite you right now?
Probably the biggest is healthcare. If you look at how expensive it is to have a health aid for the elderly, it's upwards of $175,000 to $250,000 a year to have 24/7 care in your home. As boomers are aging, that job is going to get increasingly more important. And for humanity, there would be nothing greater than every human on Earth having access to that type of care, 24/7 care in their home, to actually not put that work on one of their children or grandchildren. There are over 100 million people globally that have to take upwards of a decade off of their prime living years to care for a parent or a grandparent because they can't afford the $200,000 a year, right? I think home health aides are going to be one of the most interesting use cases for humanoids. Again, I think realistically, we're probably looking at 10 years out for that product. That sort of unstructured work. We need generalized autonomy in robotics, but it is definitely coming. That use case is massive. I think it's a $10-trillion use case and probably one of the most impactful use cases for how it improves humanity, how it improves our lives, especially the last few years of our lives when we're incapable of basically taking care of ourselves.
Chris, we all know China has been very forward-facing with its own ambitions and not just the AI space, but specifically this, humanoid robotics. Give me your sense about how you think they are looking to position themselves before 2027. And is there a so-called robot race to be won between the United States, China, or any other global player?
It just might be the most important race of our lifetime. China has $138 billion earmarked to lead the world in humanoid development. It's not about Chinese humanoids working in Western factories. That's likely never going to be allowed due to the telecommunications equipment that's wrapped in sensors and video and audio equipment. That's not something that Western companies are going to want in their manufacturing facilities. But if China wins this race, they are going to win the race to infinite physical labor, right? And when you have access to infinite physical labor, there are no bounds as to what you can achieve as a country. We cannot lose that race. So I hope the US does something to bring our kind of bleeding edge humanoid companies together. Right now they're competitors, but if you think about them, we are competing on a global scale. So I hope the US does something really big in the next 1 to 2 years to really help us compete globally and to say, hey, this is a race we cannot lose. This is a race that we need to get behind as a country to support our bleeding edge embodied AI companies. Same way with AI as well.
Chris, what part of the overall humanoid robotics story most excites you, or part of the story that you feel maybe we are not discussing enough about?
Well, I think the thing that's most exciting about this is how it bridges us to the age of abundance. You might have heard some people talking about the age of abundance. It sounds like some fantasy. I don't think it is a fantasy. I think it is a couple decades away. And it's a life where we're doing better work, more creative work. Guys like me and you, we get to do great work, right? Like you have a pretty fun job. I can tell by your background. You can tell by my background, I have a pretty fun job and a pretty great life. You know, more of us need to have lives like the lives that we live, right? I don't want my kids or grandkids working in a factory moving sheet metal for 40 years. That's not the life I want for anyone on this earth. And the embodiment of AI is what's going to raise the bar for how we all live as humans, raise the bar on humanity. I think that's really important. I think the things that most people are missing out when it comes to being too, I guess, optimistic about timelines is how difficult it is to manage that last mile, right? The distribution of humanoids into these jobs. There's a lot of strategy, a lot of fine tuning involved with going from one humanoid working in a lab to 500 or 5,000 or 50,000 working across 60 different manufacturing facilities for the same company globally. A lot of fleet management, a lot of safety, right? A lot of human supervisory roles that have to be created and synthesized over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. So that's a lot of the non-sexy stuff that you just don't see in a YouTube video of a humanoid doing something interesting. And that's why I think this is going to get a lot more interesting in 3 to 7 years, but the next 24 months is going to be a lot of just heads down work for some of the best engineers in the world that are working at these humanoid companies to get us to where we need to be so that we could eventually have humanoids taking care of our parents in 10 years, right? And making their lives better and our lives better.
Could not agree with that last part more, as long as humanoid robots are not replacing the you and me, because they can't do the interview that you and I just did. Chris Camillo, you are welcome back onto Leading Indicator anytime. I appreciate you litigating the case. Chris is a social arbitrage trader and investor, also co-host of Dumb Money Live. Chris, thanks a lot. Learned it.